Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for watching. I'm so excited to get to present this research because I've been working on it with my professor for just under a year now, which is crazy. But I'm Hannah Dellenbaugh. I'm a student in the College of Health. I'm studying recreational therapy. And my faculty mentor is Professor Melissa Zoll. She's been in the field for a great long deal, longer than I have. And we have been working on a study that examines shared leisure and leisure experiences with people who have neurological conditions and their domestic partners. Basically, we're just looking at relationships where one of them has a physical disability that is a neurological condition and what leisure looks like in that relationship. So we'll break that down a little bit more. Persons with a neurological condition, anybody with any kind of disability that makes it challenging for them to use their physical capabilities. So that looks like spinal cord injury, that looks like a stroke, that looks like brain injury. Any kind of symptoms that affect moving, thinking clearly, feeling, often ends up with like exhaustion, inability to like ambulate correctly. And then looking at informal caregivers, typically this is someone who's not employed. They may be paid by the government, but someone who's giving care to people who need help taking care of themselves. So in this study, we looked specifically at domestic partners, such as married or in significant relationships. And then we are focusing specifically on shared leisure experiences. That is leisure experiences involving both of the members of the dyad. And this has been studied a little bit, but there hasn't been a whole ton of research in shared leisure with people with neurological conditions and their partners. So just kind of looking at that research that has been done, we've increasingly begun to focus on the quality of life for people with disabilities. And these studies have looked at how engagement in shared leisure activities allow caregivers to get greater satisfaction from their role. And so we're looking at improving caregiver burnout. We're looking at improving the way that caregivers are able to interact with the people that they're taking care of. And we're also looking at how participating in that leisure is really, really positive for those people with disabilities. It allows them to feel like they're engaging in meaningful activity, they are able to cope better with their illness, and they have an increased sense of control and autonomy in their lives. And I loved this quote as well, that research has consistently shown a link between partners' shared leisure time and markers of relationship health, including satisfaction, love, and stability. So we've seen in whether studies were looking at families with children with autism or ADHD, or looking at like end of life or dementia, that shared leisure has had a positive impact. And we wanted to expand how shared leisure looked at that. So our objectives for this study were to explore how persons with neurological disabilities and their caregivers define and practice shared leisure, what that looks like in their lives. We wanted to see what impact they felt like it had on them individually and then as a partnership. And we also wanted to look at what things made doing shared leisure hard for them, what challenges they ran into, what things they found worked for them, kind of just breaking down what shared leisure looks like in the relationship. So we recruited people from a lot of different areas. We looked into the hospitals. We went online to different foundations and organizations. We did a lot of word of mouth, talking to participants and having them recommend other people that we should reach out to. And had participants sign up in a rolling measure where they would take the Qualtrics study, they would be de-identified, and we would reach out to their partner as well to make sure we've got both partners filling out a Qualtrics, and then we would assign each partnership a number based on like the order of where they filled out the Qualtrics, and then the person with the 1 would always have the disability, and the person with the 2 would always be the caregiver. So for this study and the intents and purposes, we just investigated the people with the disability. In future studies, we will continue to use the information pulled from the informal caregivers, but we were just looking at the experiences of people with the neurological conditions for this thesis. So a couple different requirements that we looked at. We wanted to make sure that our participants were over 18, that they were in a long-term partnership or that they were married, that they either had a neurological condition or they were in a relationship with someone who had that, and that they also could engage with the questions that we asked them, that they could kind of sit through and understand that 30-minute interview process, because that's not always the case for people with a neurological condition. Here is a screenshot of our interview questions, and these just looked like asking them to define leisure, both individually and what it means to them and their partner, what shared leisure means to them, how they plan their time, what their interests and activities look like, what they think the effect of that shared leisure participation is, and what maybe some barriers might be, what affects that participation. And then we asked things that help them, things that they felt like supported them in being able to do those shared leisure activities. Here's a couple statistics that we pulled from the Qualtrics. We had more male participants than female participants with a disability. And we also had most participants in the higher end, in the late 40s, early 50s range. And we also had most participants that were white, with one Hispanic Latino person and two Black or African American participants. Most of our diagnoses were either ALS patients, stroke patients, or multiple sclerosis patients. We did have two traumatic brain injuries, one Guillain-Barré syndrome and one Pompe disease. And then we had a widespread on the length of relationship, with a fair amount being on the earlier end and a fair amount being very, very long-term relationships as well, which was really cool. All right, we went through the interviews, kind of parsed each individual quote out to see what information we could pull. And as we looked at these different themes, we identified three main ones that we wanted to focus on. And we looked at how leisure is time spent together. In essence, that sub-themes for that one were looking at leisure as quality time together and leisure getting out in the community and getting outside. Our second theme was finding compromise in shared leisure and looking at how couples were able to work together and be flexible for each other. And then also making sure that couples were reinventing their leisure in the face of their disability. So sub-themes for that were being at the mercy of the disability, the person with neurological conditions, acknowledging the caregiver burden, planning logistics, communication, and making sure the caregiver is getting educated. And the bulk of what we talk about is about reinventing leisure and what that shared leisure looks like post-disability. So just pulling a couple quotes to look at a couple of these different themes. 0201 talked about leisure as time together, looking at creating memories and experiences and connections for strengthening that relationship. And 1001, I loved that he talked about they can just both sit there and they're not doing the same activity, but they are spending time together, which he felt like was really what was important for them. Looking at that idea of leisure specifically as quality time, 1401 expressed that even though he was severely restricted with his diagnosis to what he was able to do, he focuses on leisure as quality time where they're talking, they're laughing together, having a conversation, that it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific activity as much as the time spent together. 0101 talked about getting outside. He liked getting out of the air, getting out of the living space, kind of this idea of separating leisure from normal everyday routine, and feeling that sense of progress and like you're going somewhere and doing something. And 041 kind of agreed with this idea of like new and exciting things and learning and seeing together, and how that really strengthened the relationship and helped them feel like they had these shared experiences that they were able to reference and go back to. Our second theme, compromise and shared leisure, talked a lot about 021, talked about how it's that give and take of sometimes leisure in the partnership focuses more on one side than the other, and you just have to make sure that there's a balance, and you've balanced prioritizing different people at different times. And 1401 agreed, saying married life is about compromising, everybody has different interests, and they do that because they're trying to serve each other. And then kind of breaking down this idea of reinventing leisure in the face of disability. I love the way that 1301 put it, talking about trying to reinvent themselves in new ways where they can still have that leisure time together. Participants had activities that they were doing before they developed these disabilities. And the way that 041 described it, they talked about how, he goes in the wheelchair while they're going on their activities, and it looks different than when he used to go with them, but now they get back and they tell him about their experiences, and it's more about him being with the people that he loves. And then something that is challenging about reinventing leisure is leisure looks so different because of disability symptoms, that planning leisure is incredibly unpredictable because symptoms could pop up and plans could totally have to change, or you might have to back out, which makes it challenging and increases the need for flexibility in leisure plans. And with that, the person with the neurological disability in almost every interview acknowledged that burden that they were placing on the caregiver. Just looking at how sometimes you aren't able to stay at things, or you aren't able to do certain activities, or certain things aren't accessible. There were often, it was expressed that there was a fear of feeling like they were holding the caregiver back, or that the caregiver was secretly frustrated with the person with disabilities. 1201 talked about how it was challenging to realize that he was always going to be the one that was being favored in that situation, and that his partner was always worried about him having a good time because of his diagnosis. But then that he's also responsible for her having a good time as well. And so just kind of that shared burden and stress. Something that helped our participants feel like they were able to reinvent their disability, their leisure, their shared leisure, is making sure that they were planning ahead and preparing. So 0101 talked about how he always calls ahead to the facilities that he is trying to, whether it's a restaurant or it's like a movie theater, like he's like, where are we parking? Like, what's the bathroom situation looking like? Is it accessible? Can I get my wheelchair in there? Making sure he has all these little details figured out so that they don't get there and then the activity is a bust because it didn't work out. And along with reinvention of leisure, there's also a big component of caregivers kind of having a proper perspective and a good expectation on what the person with neurological condition is able to do. So 1101 talked about how her husband initially struggled with her diagnosis and feeling like they were able to do anything together. And then he joined her for skiing lessons, and then it kind of changed his perspective, where he was starting to adapt things for her, or modify benches, or help her over things, and how that was significant to see the change in him kind of taking on that caregiver role more as he participated in leisure activities with her. And lastly, the most important part of any relationship, making sure couples really talked about how important it was for them to communicate. So 0901 talked about like how her husband is aware of what she is and isn't capable of and kind of helps her not overextend herself, making sure that um, she has the patience to communicate her needs, that he's able to communicate with her. And 0601 talked about how it's important to let them know when you aren't feeling great or when there is an issue, because it's okay that you're feeling that way. It's okay for you to need to cancel or to adjust the activity based on your needs and accepting that need for communication of the issue in shared leisure experiences. And lastly, I just really love this quote from 0201, this idea that figuring out this shared leisure after the diagnosis and reinventing it is finding that new space in the new you and that new relationship, really, but challenging themselves to find something new and to create something that felt right for them in their situation. So, looking at this idea of all these different themes and the different ways that leisure and shared leisure in particular were perceived, um, we felt that Newlinger's paradigm was incredibly significant. The Newlinger's paradigm looks at two different aspects. They look at perceived freedom, which is how basically participants in an activity see their ability to have choice and choice in their leisure, choice in activities. And Newlinger's paradigm also looks at intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And then there's a spectrum of work activities and leisure activities and kind of what those look like. So we found that oftentimes having that caregiving responsibility and having that disability limited the person's perception of their ability to choose what activities they wanted to do. And that forced caregivers into a little bit more of like a leisure work area where they are feeling responsibility in the leisure. And they have to look at, well, is this really worth the time and effort and energy that it's going to take me to do this activity? And then we also found how both members of the dyad, despite all the challenges and the work involved in doing activity, we're finding intrinsic value in these shared leisure experiences, and how it was able to help them find a balance between the demands of the caregiving and the need to like create leisure time for themselves and kind of helping the partnership come together and unite a little bit more. So that intrinsic motivation caused them to want to do these activities despite the inherent issues. And just kind of depending on what activity the dyad was doing, the transition was very fluid. So some participants talked about how they would just sit and do nothing together and how that was leisure for them. And we would define that as pure leisure. And then other activities require the caregiver to be putting the wheelchair in the car and transferring the person with the neurological disability into the car and then taking them all back out again and figuring out the parking spot. And that would look a little bit more like a work or a job, in which the leisure is a little bit more like work, and it's externally motivated and the tasks are very specific and constrained. But because of that relational connection, still very impactful and important. Um, and because of that relational connection, the leisure work is still satisfying and still meaningful and intrinsically motivated. And just to kind of conclude with some of the things that we felt like were important to look at in the future, we wanted to make sure that we were using this idea of shared leisure as a bonding tool to relieve caregiver burden, and also to examine accessibility limitations for people with neurological conditions and their partners in the community. What things are they um, unable to do because of lack of access, or what activities could we help them modify so that they are still able to do the things that they used to do before their diagnoses? Looking at the role of recreational therapists in this, how recreational therapists can incorporate better programming, better education for the caregivers, how they can help these dyads learn how to adapt activities to the needs of the patients and the clients, and how the caregiver and the person with the neurological condition can work collaboratively together to build a shared leisure experience that is beneficial for both of them. Finding compromise, reinvention, specific strategies, and finding that leisure satisfaction and relational satisfaction. Got a nice list of references there for you. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I will make sure I put my email. My email is u1117056@utah.edu. If you have any questions or you want to talk to me about shared leisure or anything else regarding recreational therapy, I would love to hear from you. And thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.